Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back. Several weeks ago, I had the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Alexis Peri to the show to discuss her book, Dear Unknown Friend, The Remarkable Correspondence Between American and Soviet Women. Dr. Peri is also the author of The War Within, Diaries from the Siege of Leningrad, which was the winner of the Pushkin House Book Prize and was named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the 10 best books on the Soviet home front. She is an associate professor of history at Boston University. We recorded our interview over Zoom, so I'm inserting my sound quality warning here. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Welcome back, everyone. With me today is Dr. Alexis Peri. She is a historian specializing in modern Russia and Eastern Europe with a focus on the Soviet period. She is an associate professor of history at Boston University and the author of multiple books, including Dear Unknown Friend, which will be the subject of our conversation today. Welcome, Dr. Peri.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for being here. So let's go ahead and dive right in. In your opening pages, you introduced the letter writing campaign between American and Soviet women, classifying this as a political act. What made their decision to exchange letters political?
Well, in the beginning, it was not just political, it was strategic. It was actually a project that a particular bureaucracy during the Second World War, a Soviet bureaucracy, came up with. And it was a scheme to try to get women in the Western Allied countries, especially Britain and the United States, to provide more support. At that point in the war, the Soviet Union was really bearing the brunt of the Nazi onslaught with huge amounts of territories under occupation and so forth. And so the idea was that if Soviet women reached out to women in the West, they could get them to rally their governments to send more aid. Maybe those women would do war industry jobs, freeing up more men for the front. So it was originally kind of a scheme, and the Pen Pal program remained very political over its existence into the Cold War. But what was really interesting to me was that the official political objectives of the project never really panned out. And instead, what the letter writers discussed was sort of how personal life is political. I think that was sort of the big discovery, was the ways in which the personal is political. Things like everyday life choices, how you raise your kids, how you manage your time, whether or not you try to be a mother and have a career. All of those things are deeply political. And that was something that they realized more and more over the course of writing.
Yeah. And you talk a little bit in your introduction about kind of the discovery of these letters. So can you talk about like how you found these letters and really what prompted you to tell the story?
Sure. I mean, I was shocked. I was so surprised. It was one of those wonderful moments of discovery that we all live for. But I was in Moscow working in the state archives, which is sort of what most historians do, go on these hunts and search for unpublished documents. And I was there to do a totally different project. I really wanted to write the history of how Soviet women really rebuilt the USSR when the war was over. Because after the war ended, they were really the only able-bodied labor force. They and German POWs who were also kept in the Soviet Union. But the male population had been so decimated. Women literally rebuilt the streets and the roads and the buildings. So I wanted to tell that story, and I still want to tell it, but I got a bit sidetracked. So I started looking at files from the war, and I found a couple letters here and there. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then I found a few more. And then I started to change what I was requesting to cut files that I suspected had a lot of letters. And soon I found hundreds and then thousands of letters, not just with American women, but with British women and French women. And then later in the 1950s, women in China and East Asia, etc. And I was so excited because, I really love telling history from this personal lens, trying to get a sense of people's individual lives, especially in a state as big as the Soviet Union. It's hard to get at that sometimes. But I was worried. I thought, well, I don't know about these letters. I mean, they're interesting, but how do I know they're not totally made up, right?
Mm.
I thought maybe there were two people, right? Two sort of Soviet bureaucrats and maybe two members of the FBI or CIA in a room posing as hundreds of different women. So that was the next step, was to try to corroborate these stories and figure out who these people were and use other kinds of different data, different archives in the United States and other places. So once I felt more sure of that piece and I had learned a lot more about these women's lives, then I thought this was such a cool project because the story I had always been told that I, to be honest, continued to teach to my own students up until really recently was that, the Soviet Union and the United States were allies temporarily during World War II. And that was a marriage of convenience. And then they quickly went back to their adversarial relationship. And people, I assumed, sort of switched on a dime, just like they did. Soviet people and American people went back to suspecting each other and so forth. And then I also learned that it wasn't until these kind of classic benchmarks like the Geneva Conference or death of Stalin or, Khrushchev opening up the Soviet Union to the West, that there was really no communication between Soviet and American civilians between the war and this sort of thawing of the Cold War that happens in the mid 50s. And finding these letters is just not true. It was just simply not true. And it was something I had been wrong about for decades. And I was delighted to discover that I was incorrect.
Yeah, I love the historical discoveries that people find, right? You're always starting on one topic and then inevitably something beautiful and unexpected just crops to the surface and it opens up this whole new line of inquiry. So I love hearing those stories.
Yes, that's why we do this. It's like the thrill of discovery.
Yes. And so talking about these letters, yeah, I'm sure you spent so much time with them and building this analysis. What can these letters tell us about the contemporary experiences of those who lived through the Cold War?
Yeah, so I think a lot. I think it can tell us a lot. Some of the things that most stuck with me that I was surprised and interested to find was first just what I alluded to earlier, that Soviet and American people didn't stop appreciating each other or being interested in each other when, in 1945, when the war ended. And they continued to draw on the alliance as a kind of source of inspiration when things got really tense during the Cold War. They would often write things like, our governments have gotten along in the past. We can do this again. Like, we can find a way to agree. So that, I think, was surprising for me. Other things surprising were that there was such a wide variety of women who wrote. Now, I mean, obviously they were not average, because an average person sort of does not pick up their pen and write a letter to someone they've never met in a country that's historically hostile to them. That's not a typical act. But these were women from lots of different walks of life. And in the United States, for example, it was a lot of women initially with very moderate politics, many who identified as conservatives, many who were religious and deeply religious and from small towns who were interested in talking with someone who lived in a big city far away. And then in the Soviet case, they were less, was less variety because they were very closely vetted. But I was really interested to find out that they were not party members. They were not sort of the classic people who could write, which were party members, professional propagandists, or sort of heroes of labor, as they referred to in the Soviet Union. In fact, there was explicit discussion in the archival documents in Moscow that they were not going to choose party members to write to Americans, whereas they did for other countries where for example, British and French women from the communist parties in those countries wrote. And so then they matched them with Soviet women who were communists. But in the United States, they didn't do that. And I think a couple of things that also surprised me in connection with that is the extent to which the Soviet women in particular sort of failed to do their official duty as propagandists. So they knew why they were being allowed to talk with women in the bourgeois capitalist West, which was a kind of unheard of thing. And they knew they were supposed to promote various Soviet ideals and and policies, and they did in their own ways, but they only really did it by talking about personal things from their own lives. They did it by telling their own stories, explaining, what they loved about their lives, where they struggled, how they got to be where they were. So it's all deeply personal. And there were lots of occasions when the organization overseeing them said, look, you have to promote the Soviet Peace Committee or the Stockholm Petition or these very specific kinds of policies and ventures. And they just didn't do it. They just did not do it. They didn't follow orders. I mean, they were certainly not free to write whatever they want, but they made a lot of creative choices and a lot of leeway. That was really interesting too.
Yeah.
So the big Soviet complaint was like, these letters are not propagandistic enough. They're not doing enough for us. And I guess that leads me to the final thing I want to mention that was really surprising. And that is, I was just so interested in how extensively these women opened up to each other, given the circumstances. I mean, they hid things. They didn't give a full account of their biographies. They often used fake names. Soviet women in particular concealed some like traceable things about their identity. But it was delightful and interesting to see that anonymity, right, can also lead to a lot of intimacy and transparency. Sometimes they would tell each other secrets or things that they were ashamed of because they knew they would never meet each other.
Right.
And it was sort of a safe person to tell. They would complain about certain things or talk about certain struggles and a lot of heartache. Soviet women in particular were supposed to be sort of stoic during the war, and they wrote extensively about losing husbands and children and so forth during the war. So I think I really was surprised and interested to see that such an orchestrated correspondence can also lead to really, really personalized conversation, even if it's not, we can't say that it's, 100% sincere. I think there were really high levels of sincerity that are visible from what they wrote.
Yeah, I think when I was reading the book, the thing that came across to me was the level of vulnerability between the exchanges, right? They were just so open to sharing their experiences and the similarities between their lives, the similarities and the differences. I just thought that was such wonderfully teased out for the reader.
And it's so surprising, and I think admirable, really, that they approached politics through vulnerability,
right?
Instead of just relying on what their governments were doing, and the kind of rhetoric they were totally saturated in, which was really militaristic. It was really offensive, aggressive, and there were lots of moments when I thought, with the kind of voice of the Kremlin or voice of the White House in mind, that these women could have gone for the jugular, like there were lots of moments when Soviet women could have brought up Jim Crow in the United States. And there were lots of moments when American women could have brought up sort of the Gulag and the Stalinist police state. And there were moments when they talked about race and they talked about the prison system, but they didn't do it to sort of delegitimize what the other person was saying. And that shows this incredible amount of restraint. And I think commitment to the relationship, because it would have been so easy to just attack.
Right.
I mean, they had these scripts available to them all around them. And that's not what they chose to do. And it's not one or two women who didn't choose to do that. It was hundreds of women who chose not to do that. So that's sort of why I make this case that they really saw this as a different way of doing politics.
Yeah. And you also, this is a great segue into the next question is you discuss this idea of a new kind of women's diplomacy. And so what was it and how did it impact the Cold War?
That's a great question. So I'm not sure, to be totally honest, that it was completely new. But what I definitely saw was that they thought it was new. That is to say, there were a lot of comments from both sides that discussed a kind of failure of diplomacy in the past, especially with the war and this fear that another war was coming right after the Second World War was over. And in American letters, they really gender this. They really say sort of like, men have failed us, right? Men are so aggressive. Men can't work it out. They can't come up with a peaceful resolution. Soviet women are a little less pointed that way, but they too talked about needing a fresh start of a new diplomatic approach. And it's something I call diplomacy of the heart, which is a kind of paraphrasing of what a lot of the letter writers say. They don't use that phrase exactly, but they talk about the importance of proceeding from the heart or connecting heart to heart very explicitly instead of connecting through the mind. They make very clear that they see that the heart is the route to the mind.
Mm.
So the sort of cliche about winning hearts and minds, they revise that and they put the heart first over the mind and talk about how people are led by emotions. They're led by personal experiences, and that empathy is a better route to understanding than something like policy debate. So it's really the diplomacy of the heart is idea that displays of vulnerability could be more effective than sort of displays of national strength and aggression in creating some kind of understanding and accord between these two countries.
Yeah. And you alluded to this a little earlier, but what inspired a letter writing campaign between the women of these two countries?
Yeah, well, the official inspiration was to win the war. And again, from the Soviet side, it was very strategic. Send more troops, right? Open a second front in Europe. That was kind of Stalin's, routine cry until D-Day happened. Um, but I think what actually inspired them, I should back up and say, I think they were genuinely inspired about winning the war, but that didn't necessarily mean it was all about arms and troops and munitions. A lot of the American women who joined never got a letter from the Soviet Union. They just initiated this on their own, and they do it after the Battle of Stalingrad in particular. There's this sort of huge rush of enthusiasm and admiration for the Red Army in the United States after Stalingrad. And it shows up in Life magazine and Look magazine and Hollywood movies. So it's certainly not manufactured by this pen pal program, but those small letters that people sent, and I have to tell you, they're kind of a hoot because they often just had on the envelope, or the salutation would just say to a person in Russia. They just put a stamp on it. There is no address. There's no intended recipient. It was just sent out into the ether. But because the Soviet bureaucracy was so centralized, they got all those letters and then they sorted them and they sent the women's letters to the women's committee who ran it, and then other letters to other people in other cases. So I think the enthusiasm was often genuine, even though it was it was a state initiative. Lots of people ended up being a part of it who had no knowledge of that state initiative, especially in the United States. That came back to hurt many of them during McCarthyism. Mention. But I think that stayed inspirational. And then the idea that ordinary people, as they define themselves, really can put aside their political differences. And if they just sort of shift their perspective and keep an open mind and share about themselves, that really can add up to significant change. And sometimes we're really skeptical about that idea today. But I think we still also, many of us have this hope that sort of if we just sat down in a room and talked through our differences, we would find common ground. And that, I think that remains a guiding light for a lot of people in divisive political times, maybe today as well. Yeah. And it's powerful to see people not only think that, but act on it.
Yeah. And we've talked a lot about these women and how they were kind of, not your prototypical diplomat. So, who were the women that participated in the pen pal program, and how did they deviate from the quote unquote professional diplomat?
Yeah. So they were not ordinary at all, but they all described themselves as ordinary and typical. Partially out of modesty, but also by design, because it was one way of saying, we're not official diplomats. And that freed them up in a lot of ways. It was a way of saying, first of all, we can speak plainly and honestly. There was a sort of sense that non-professionals would be more sincere for us, right? So, politicians are not to be trusted kind of idea. But there was also this way of, by casting themselves as ordinary, it also meant that they could say, look, I'm not actually responsible for any of the decisions of my government. Right? That's not me. I can separate myself from that. And that also proved to be really useful. But in other senses, they were kind of typical. So the American women in particular, But also the Soviet women, almost none of them had ever been abroad. Um, the American women in particular talked about being from small towns and feeling isolated. And some of them wanted a pen pal because they just wanted to talk to somebody. They wanted this kind of virtual form of travel. They wanted to have interesting conversations. They wanted community. And I think that's a really human impulse. The Soviet women also talked about things like they were really interested in America. And they say that over and over again during this sort of official anti-American campaign that the Kremlin ran. They were interested in Americans. They liked American movies. They liked American fashion. They wanted to ask questions about that. So there was a lot of genuine interest. The American women, as I mentioned earlier, the population who writes changes a little bit over time, but the vast majority remain women who are high school educated. Some had a little bit of college education. Almost all described themselves as housewives. Almost all had multiple children. They varied in age. Some were mothers, some were grandmothers. But that's generally how they described themselves. They had traveled little, but they were very curious. And they often did paid work outside the home, but they really identified as mothers first and foremost. And the Soviet women were from a much narrower group. During the war, they were they represented different constituencies. Some were farmers, some were industrial workers, some were soldiers in the Red Army. But after the war, the letter writing organization, the organization that oversaw it, really tried to keep things under wraps. So then they mostly allowed women from Moscow to write, not from other places.
Mm.
They were based in Moscow, so they could keep tabs on those women. They could coach them in what to write, and they could, of course, inspect their letters. And they also chose women, Soviet women who were professionals. They chose doctors and lawyers and chemists and teachers. They chose zookeepers. There's a number of zookeepers. And the idea was that these Soviet women would model the kinds of opportunities available to women in the Soviet Union so that they would inspire just by who they were and what they did. So there was a kind of mismatch initially between who was writing on one side, right? These sort of urban professionals from the Soviet Union, and then these housewives from small towns in the United States. But as you mentioned earlier, it was delightful for them to discover how much they had in common.
Right, right. And speaking of the kind of the committees and the agencies that are heavily involved in this campaign, what
Yeah.
was the Soviet Women's Anti-Fascist Committee, and what role did it play in the letter writing campaign?
Yeah, so they actually came up with the whole idea. So the Soviet Women's Anti-Fascist Campaign or Committee, rather, there were five anti-fascist committees that the Soviet Information Bureau, this bureaucracy that was in charge of basically controlling and disseminating information during World War II, they came up with these anti-fascist committees. And the idea was, let's have these groups reach out to allies in the West and help strengthen the war effort, strengthen the alliance. So the Committee of Women was just one of those committees. And actually, as is maybe typical, it was like the least well-funded, the least well-known. There were two committees like that, Committee of Women and the Committee of Children. The other committee sent emissaries abroad to New York City and Washington, D.C. They held rallies. They were much more like doing face-to-face fundraising, really.
Mm.
And the women just didn't have that resource. That wasn't possible. So they decided they would write pamphlets, which they did, and they'd hold events and they'd speak on radio. But the letter writing campaign was just something they came up with because they felt like their other schemes weren't working.
Mm.
And they had to work from the Central Committee of the Communist Party to get permission to do it. It was a risk because there was no precedent for this. It was not customary to let Soviet people have access to the experiences and the perspectives of people living in the West, especially people who were not official emissaries of the state. So it was a big risk. It was a big experiment, but the war was so bad, they thought, let's give it a try. And then maybe even more shockingly, when the war was over, they considered canceling the program, but they actually allowed it to keep going. Neither country let men participate, though. I should.
And that actually that brings me to my next question, which was, you talk about how there were early attempts at establishing a pen pal program that just they were met with relative silence. They weren't really able to get off the ground. And so, perhaps it was just the war that created this shift. But
Yeah.
what caused the shift?
Yeah. So the Soviet Union had pen pal programs before the war, but they were all very much about connecting with socialists abroad.
Mm.
So they were, very specific to very specific groups like socialist revolutionaries in Germany or leftist progressives in the United States. They were very kind of specific groups. It was all about building an international communist movement. So the war, again, really is a game changer because suddenly there's all these military alliances that don't align with ideological similarities. So the war makes it really different. But I think what's interesting about that is not just that they that the war put Soviets in touch with capitalists, right? People, bourgeoisie in the Marxist terms, but that it was women in particular is really interesting because women were not at the forefront of any diplomacy in the United States or in the Soviet Union. And that makes it really different. And they put women in the forefront for a couple of reasons, and not all of them good. I mean, one of them was the idea that, well, first it was the anti-fascist committee that came up with it. So that it was there, that was the main reason. But they didn't want men to do this. They thought it was too big of a security risk. And that when I say they, I mean both Soviet officials and American officials. The State Department put the kibosh on it. There were several American men who tried to write, and their names were promptly handed over to the FBI for surveillance.
Oh, wow.
Neither side thought men should be allowed to do this because men, knew too much. They might be a security risk, but both governments really had this like they're just women attitude, you know, and they and they stereotype saying, well, women are good at making friends, women are nice. Um, and also women are relatively harmless, so that in sense that they have no political authority whatsoever. And so if this goes wrong, it's not a huge risk. So it was fascinating to see, ideological differences aside, these governments basically operated under very similar gendered assumptions about who does politics and who doesn't.
Yeah. So speaking about gender assumptions, I am curious, how do these letters kind of demonstrate for us the variations of gender ideology and practice between the United States and the USSR?
Yeah, well, I think that's something I didn't expect to find, but it's there, it shows up all over the letters in every little place. I mean, it's amazing. So, um, it shows up in the way that, first of all, the salutations, because the Soviet women thought they would be paired with someone who did their same job, which is a very Soviet approach, right? Assumes labor is like the core of your identity. And so women who get along will be women who do the same job. So their salutations said things like, "Dear American female chemist,
Mm.
dear American female doctor." And they just assumed that there were lots of women in the United States who were chemists and physicists and doctors. And that didn't pan out. I saw in the archive some letters were addressed, to a worker, and then the anti-fascist committee crossed it out and wrote to a mother. So they had to change compatibility. So the salutations were one thing. The signatures were also an issue because American women at this time mostly used their husbands' first names to write their name,
Mm.
right? Mrs. Walter Smith or something like that. And that was really puzzling for Soviet women who'd write back, "Dear Walter, thank you so much for your letter." And then they'd have to correct them and say, "Well, no, that's actually my husband's name." And then conversations about, well, why do you use your husband's name? So gender kind of shows up everywhere. And then of course it showed up in the details of how they described their lives, how they introduced themselves. And it's interesting to watch the letter writers discover both this about both their own lives and their pen pals' lives, that things that we do that we take for granted are thoroughly tied to gender identity.
Yeah. And ultimately, how successful do you think the Pen Pal program was at shifting opinions and cementing alliances?
Well, that's a great question because because officially it was a big fat failure, is what they said. It was a terrible failure. unofficially, I think there were a lot of successes. I'll mention why it's a failure first. So, from the perspective of the Soviet government, it was a failure because their goal was basically to convert American women to socialism. And that didn't happen. At least nobody said, I've been converted. So that was definitely a failure. It was a failure from the perspective of the United States government, too, because the United States government also wanted to see this heavy attempt at ideological conversion because they were intent to hold up this letter writing program as evidence of communist infiltration, right? Of spying and espionage. And that also didn't pan out. They tried lots of times to prosecute the American organization responsible for the letter writing, and they went after some individual letter writers, but largely without success. So that was a failure, right? It wasn't propagandistic enough from the perspective of both governments. But if you put aside sort of ideological conversion as the sole metric of success, I think there are other successes. I mean, certainly the letter writer's goal of sort of preventing war and creating peaceful relations between the United States and Soviet Union, that didn't fully pan out. I mean, they did prevent it. They didn't prevent, but there was no direct war, but lots of proxy wars and so forth. But I think where it was successful was this goal of achieving a deeper appreciation and understanding for someone. I think there it really was successful. And one of the pieces of evidence for that is that they wrote for so many years. I mean, some of them wrote for 10 years and they exchanged dozens and dozens of letters. And they did so under great duress, sort of where political climate was such that they shouldn't be doing this. And many said they were scared to do it. And they did it anyway. And I think that that kind of commitment is evidence that they were getting something out of this, that they felt connected to their interlocutor, even if that person didn't convince them to adopt a new set of political beliefs. I think that's powerful. And then as I was following up with the stories of some of these women, I did discover that quite a few of them made dramatic life changes. Some made political changes that were not necessarily because of their pen pal, but they were changes consistent with what their pen pals had advised them to do. And that was really interesting. So I think, I know there are a lot of women who chose to get divorces, to go back to school, to really start new lives for themselves. There are women who sort of shifted politically, especially in the United States, from supporting Republicans to supporting progressives in terms of presidential candidates and other things. And in Soviet women, it's harder to trace some of those changes, but many of them who kept memoirs or later wrote talked about how they had a much deeper appreciation for the difficulty of raising children, especially without state support, and talked a lot more about desire for material goods and things like this that they were getting from their American pen pals. So I think the pen pal conversations were deeply influential, but maybe in a way that was a bit more diffuse, a bit more indirect than either of the governments were looking and expecting to see.
Yeah. I think for me, reading this book, I walked away from it was a perfect example of the adage, the politics is personal, right? That
Yes.
Opening up these conversations were so important, maybe not, like you said, for those quote unquote official reasons, but for a whole host of unofficial reasons. So that was my big takeaway from reading this book. But I am curious, what do you hope future readers get from your analysis?
Yeah, well, that's one of them. I'm so glad you took that away because I think that's important. And I think that, the personal is political has become a cliche, but only because it's so true. And only because there were so many social movements in the late 20th century that really showcase this, from the women's rights movement to civil rights and other things. And I think that maybe not so much today, but I think for a long time, the experience of women and people in the middle of the century was a little bit overlooked. There's a way of thinking of the 40s and the 50s as this really kind of conservative time of conformity and acquiescence and so forth. And we think of the 60s as this really revolutionary time. But these, in many ways, the movements of the 60s are powered in part by the experiences of the 40s and 50s. And I think that the letters really helped me see that. And in the Soviet case too, they have social movements that emerged later in the 20th century, and I wanted to show that these were connected to earlier generations and earlier events. But I think there was one other thing I really hope readers take away from this, other than the fact that the personal is political has a long history, and it was a discovery in conservative times as well as radical ones. And that other takeaway is that this is possible. That it's possible even in the most most polarized political times, that we can talk with somebody and try to understand them, and that it can be a productive conversation. I think that is really a lesson for our own moment, because this pen pal organization and project came at a time not that different from our own. It came at a time when, the United States and the Soviet Union were at odds, when their governments sort of thought that less contact was better, that they should shut off communication to prevent political disaster. It was a time when people were afraid, when people were immersed in disinformation about each other's countries. And nonetheless, a group of people came forward and said, there's got to be a better way, that maybe we achieve better understanding with more communication, not less. And maybe if we try to, set aside some hot button issues and talk about ourselves, and talk about ourselves and each other in a way that doesn't make the other person wrong all the time, doesn't correct them, right, or attack them, that can be actually really productive politically. So even though it was on a small scale, I think it's a lesson that we can take to heart, and I think it's admirable to see people try to sort of transcend the tribalism of their own time. And certainly our moment is one where the United States and Russia are not seeing eye to eye. There's a great deal of misinformation, disinformation, and animosity. And it's a time where Americans, in our own country are equally separated, unwilling to talk to one another, unwilling to listen, think it's just impossible to find ways to communicate. And I understand that kind of feeling, but I'm also inspired by people who weren't stopped by that and strove to find a way anyway.
Yeah, I think amid all the chaos and the vitriol in our present moment, I always look to history anyways, because I find it very grounding. But this book came, I think, at the right time, because to your point, it demonstrates that there are different ways to facilitate productive conversations. There are ways to kind of get to know the other side without there being, a need to separate or be violent or have some sort of confrontation. And I just thought it's a book for our current moment.
I think so. I mean, it became more and more relevant as I was working on it, in trying to find the pen pals and their families. I think all my letters to Russia got returned because suddenly they were in violation of U.S. sanctions. Or, many of my friends and contacts in Russia stopped writing openly to me, as they're very worried about state surveillance, and their emails and so forth being monitored. So, I mean, these are very real political realities, and they really struck a chord with the policies of the late 40s, where a lot of information sharing and contact between Americans and Soviets was forbidden, when Soviets weren't allowed to marry a foreigner, right? They were really concerned about the personal ties as a way of sort of infiltrating their country politically. And yet here are this almost 800 women writing to each other and doing that. And so it's a kind of amazing example of how you can engage in productive discourse.
Yeah, indeed. And so where should people go when they've finished this book and they want to learn more about you and your scholarship?
Well, that's it. That's a good question. I don't have a huge presence online. I'm a real paper and pencil kind of person, but they can go to bu.edu/history and read my profile there. It has my publications, or they can go to Harvard University Press and see the publications there.
Wonderful. And is there anything we haven't covered yet that you want future readers to know?
I would say just don't discount the power of the personal and the power of women also. I think one of the most delightful parts of this story was all of these assumptions that women just, that they're so insignificant, um, that this doesn't really matter, that they can't do any harm. And they also, reciprocally can't have any power or impact. And I think one of the funniest discoveries I saw um, was a handful of men who tried to join the program and sent in letters, and they were all rejected from the program, not because they were men, but because they weren't interesting. Oh, their letters were really argumentative. They were progressive. They were kind of read like a treatise, and the responders just said, "I'm sorry, but your letter doesn't tell me anything about you,
Yeah.
so I don't want to engage in this pen pal relationship." And so I think that the sense that women, that they can potentially engage in diplomacy in a different way is a really interesting one, and I don't think certainly only women can do it, but I guess I just saw it as a plug for really trying a new style of communication,
Yeah.
whether that's gendered or not, but how it can be much more productive to open with a "hello, how are you?" instead of a "here's what I think is wrong with the way your government operates."
Well said. Well, for all the listeners out there, I highly recommend grabbing a copy of Dear Unknown Friend. Dr. Peri does a fantastic job in highlighting the important work of everyday people, and it's an insightful look into women's experiences during the Cold War. Thank you again, Dr. Peri.
Oh, thank you so much. I had a wonderful time.
A big thanks again to Dr. Peri for sharing her scholarship with me. If you have an interest in women's history or U.S.-Soviet relations history, I highly recommend picking up a copy of her book. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.